and good. Now to open the case of the government bench, let me call on the Prime Minister.
Here, here! Here! Parang wala po siyang microphone. Parang yun yun. Maganda ito, maganda ito.
Gusta
Sino mo tatapirmi? Huwag kang ganun kay may tito o sulgaw na nakaabang. May video sa mga anak.
Mr. Chair, panel, we believe that coming from opening government, that even in the status quo, we have to recognize that people, especially especially of society, actually recognize Marcos as someone evil, right? But we have to consider that evil, that portrayal of absolute evil, has done more harm than good at the very end of the day, right? So let's talk about what's the context of or what's the social reality happening today, right? People are passionate about are completely passionate about telling that Marcos is completely evil and that they are blinded by the other but they are blinded by other politicians that are present at the very end of the day. That's why, coming to our first argument, why we believe that it creates a harmful standard for corrupt politicians in the first place. We have to consider that this type of the portrayal of absolute evil has created a standard for how evil a politician should be, right? Or how the Filipino people see Marcos as the absolute evil or the epitome of evil. But why is that so harmful, and how did that happen? Firstly, we have to consider that it creates a palatable for other evils to be palatable for other people in society, right? An example of this is how people necessarily compare the martial law of how Duterte runs it compared to Marcos, right? We have to talk about how that martial law still creates abuses in the military for other peoples that society or the Filipinos can actually see. We have to consider that the discourse of the political discourse happening in the Philippines is no longer regulated because of the fact that Marcos has set a standard on how it should be, right? We believe that it creates a way. It's like a slam to the door, door slam to the face, right? Something lesser makes it more palatable to society. We believe that it's especially we believe that it's especially prominent, especially in the Filipino people, where people lack the capacity to find out more information about these types of politicians at the very end of the day. Because people are blinded by how Marcos was so evil at the very end of the day, right? Because you have to consider on how we concede coming from opening government that it lets people recognize of how these types of things are so condemnable. But we have to consider that we don't have to make him absolutely evil at the very end of the day, because people still because we believe that people would still call him evil, and the discourse for that evil is still present. Given that people have that natural incentive to create that discourse, or they have a natural way of actually understanding that evil, given that they can still feel the harms of what Marcos did. So we believe that we still recognize evil in a sense that we leave room for the doubt, right? Take for example, people leave a room of doubt for evil politicians in status quo in comparison to how Marcos was portrayed at the very end of the day, right? But how did this did more harm than good in the first place? We have to consider that the political landscape of the Philippines right now, as people still keep on rooting on how Marcos did it in comparison to how Duterte comparison to how Duterte does it at the very thing. Allowing people to remember that disaster creates a mismatch in society on how they can actually further recognize political incorrections or things like that. We have to consider that the ideas that happen online, or even in Twitter, for example, or even how people portray these types of things. Take for example in Facebook or what have you. People tend to compare. People tend to compare. It's not. He's not like. At least he's not like Marcos or what have you. Because people tend to become complacent of. People tend to become complacent of lesser harms or lesser evil that's not being seen in comparison to Marcos at the very thing. What's our conclusion coming from opening government? We believe that it does more harm than good because people don't have that capacity anymore, or has lost the standard to actually tell of if the politician is deserving or not, right? Because tendency here is now people only see the image of Marcos as being evil, and it's not for example Bong Revilla on how they see him as something that's that something's okay because there's not necessarily any harm that's inflicted compared to what Marcos did in the very first place. We believe that it has done more harm than good in the course for greater discourse, because we believe that we have to consider that we can't blind, or we can't make an absolute way of actually judging a person at the very thing. We have to leave room for discussion for these types of individuals, especially in the political landscape of the Philippines, right, where corruption is super prominent. That's why we think that. That's why we believe that the benefits the harms outweigh the benefits, right? Because they can only recognize, or they can only create a standard for these types of things. But we believe that standard is so harmful to a point where people tend to root lesser evils to that of himself and create complacency in the system. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you, Prime Minister. Now to open the case of the opposition, let me call on the leader of the opposition. Here.
In a country where even our own people were manipulated and oppressed on all possible levels, when they couldn't even mobilize to take action, we think that it's justified to portray the Marcoses as absolutely evil because it was a tool to get these people to unify for a collective cause that put down that oppressive structure. And we think that the soft narrative painted by the government side is exactly the problem why we have so many confused Marcos apologists in the current status quo. We on the opposition side are here today to tell you why there's a need to deal with absolutes based on two levels of analysis. One, we think that it's needed to portray the Marcoses as absolutely evil as it played a necessary role in the overthrowing of the Marcos regime. And second, how in this current status quo, it prevents a room for perspective manipulation. Going on to my first point, let's take a look at exactly what happened during the Marcos regime. So the people before, they were controlled by the monopoly of the military power of the Marcoses, but the bigger control that the Marcoses had over the people was its control over the perspective of the population. They were also controlled by the propaganda of the Marcoses, and they weren't even sure if they wanted to overthrow this regime. How did the Marcoses do this in the first place? They would promote a positive influence on select pockets of the population in the form of, for example, feeding programs, propaganda, forms of employment and benefits. Now, the main benefit of this selective putting up a selective image of a good regime would would be to deter any chances of challenging the regime, as the people would be too busy fighting for themselves. For example, certain pockets of populations would say na we should overthrow the Marcos regime. The people who receive those benefits would counter and would say na no, because the Marcoses are actually helping us. That form of discussion is the reason why we think that form of discussion is the reason why we think that it took such a long time for the people to gain traction with their movement. And let's take, for example, the importance of the narrative of dealing of absolutes. The importance of having such a narrative is that we're influencing people to be on the same side. We're telling people that we should have uniform ideas, which is necessary in order for us to take up a collective cause. Because if the people are divided, then this is exactly the perfect form of situation that allowed the Marcoses to stay in power for such a long time. And that is exactly the tool that they use to maintain their power and to prevent any form of discussion that went against them. It is a narrative, we think, on the government side, that opposition side, that it is a narrative that served as the foundation of the revolution, because people needed to agree on the same thing before they could agree what to do and before they could actually start the EDSA revolution, which overthrew the Marxist in the first place. Second point is like we'd like to point out the harms that the government side are proposing that are present in the current status quo. We think that it is harmful to portray the Marcoses in an objective sense because it prevents room for perspective manipulation. We're willing to bite the bullet and say that maybe it portrays a form of one-sided discussion, but we think this one-sided discussion is necessary in order to make the Marcoses accountable for their historical atrocities. So in the country right now, we have a lot of Marcos apologists. The problem therein with having such a perspective is that you promote a leeway for perspective manipulation. It's so easy to switch the perspective from not necessarily evil to possibly good. And that's the problem and that's the problem in the first place. Because through propaganda, through mismanipulation of the media, through their networks, that's the thing that the Marcoses are doing. And it's the reason why they've garnered such strong political influence. The Marcoses are we think that it justifies the atrocity. We think that it's necessary to paint the picture that the Marcoses are absolutely evil as portraying them as a soft narrative painted by the government allows the Marcoses to continue what they're doing, such as online propaganda and manipulation of the public, which in the worst case scenario could allow them to justify the atrocities committed by the Marcoses. So by leaving leeway for manipulation, you're arming the Marcos apologists with a tool that they can use to control the discussion of society. What do we mean when we say now we want them to be portrayed as absolute evil? We want to make sure that the people don't forget what the Marcoses did in our history. The problem with having multiple narratives is you're telling people it's okay to believe which side you're on. And the problem with that perspective is that it assumes that all sides are treated equally. We are telling you here that the problem here is that when you allow leeway for multiple narratives, it's so easy for certain bodies of population, for example, the Marcos apologists, to choose which perspective or narrative they want to highlight and emphasize. It could be so easy for them to choose the harmful narrative that, for example, what the Marcoses did were justified, that they were okay, that they weren't so bad, and that form of manipulation is the reason why we have such a confused population right now in the current status quo. So the negative narrative, we believe, is an important tool that would spearhead discussion in society right now. A discussion that would force the Marcoses to acknowledge their crimes, would force the Marcoses to take action, because the people aren't siding with them anymore. The people are looking at them through the lens of victims. They're looking at the Marcoses, and what they're seeing are villains of history. And we think that image is important because only through that image do we get the people to force the Marcoses to take action and make amends for what they have done through our history. So In conclusion, we have told you why this was a necessary evil that helped us put down the greater evil that was the oppression of the Marcos regime, and how the evil that today, that is the perspective manipulation of the Marcoses and Marcos apologies. And with that, I am proud to oppose. Abi Charta Manduka.
Okay, so thank you, Errol. Now to provide extensions coming from the opening government, let me call on the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Hello. Number one, OO's case is only going to fly if we set the context when a martial law is actually happening on the ground. Because their number one point was actually traction. That, we need to portray Marcos as the absolute evil for us to be able to overthrow them to begin with. We say that their case is actually trying to propagate a narrative that there's an urgent problem happening. But we concede to that, even after that, we say that we also need to consider the long-term effects. When we, for example, have these types of portrayals on what's absolute, on why we don't need to, for example, equalize all kinds of portrayal of evilness, and when there's only going to be absolutes towards Marcoses as evil. Because we want to say, where do we see people create better discussions on condemning evil? Is it when we, for example, set a standard of how evil looks like? Is it only when we're going to condemn people who's as bad as portrayed how Marcos was? Or is it when we don't portray Marcos as the absolute evil and we see all evil, all kinds of evil, as something that's evil and that's something that's worthy to be condemning, right? Because our goal is to not have a standard of evil. Rather, we want to recognize different kinds of evil, even coming from my partner. Because we see that these kinds of portrayal puts more harm on the long-term effects, right? Because we see that people now becomes complacent to the idea that, it's okay to be evil as long as it's not on the standard of how society put it on, because of the standardized portrayal that Marcos is the absolute evil to begin with. We say that when Bong Revilla was characterized as a corrupt politician, the status of evilness is just as harmful when we, for example, say that Marcos abused Philippines because through martial law, for example. We say that these types of characterization is very important because now we don't tolerate different kinds of evil. That when you say being corrupt is still okay because it's not martial law to begin with. Because we see that type of portrayal leads to this, right? Because what's the likelihood? We see that people are going to react into portrayals because people are more likely to believe on what they hear and what they see, especially due to exposure. Because we see that when people are more exposed to these types of narratives, when there's an equal percent of portrayal, people become tolerant to that kind of idea, and by which accepts that because of the tolerance happening at the end of the day. We want to recognize all kinds of evil to begin with. Because how do we compare which is more and less in terms of harms, right? Because we see that portraying Marcos as absolute evil sets a social standard that, for example, he is the number one arbiter of evilness, and that it's okay to be evil as long as it's not of the same caliber. Because we say that the different kinds of evil, that for example, when we consider minimal kinds of evil, becomes palatable to the society, that people become tolerant to this kinds of idea. Because we say that the harm in hindsight fosters a society that tolerates different kinds of evil, as we see that it's necessarily really still harmful compared to the benefits. Because we should necessarily condemn all kinds of evil, not just the evil portrayed upon Marcos to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. Because when talking about our case, a portrayal leads to a standardized narrative of what evil looks like, which disregards all different kinds of evil. The standard of harm, we see that the standard of harm in this case, even presented by my partner, is when we tolerate different kinds of evil because we set a standard of what's absolute evil. Why do we credit this, right? Because we see that a standard is more harmful than good, right? We create potential leaders complacent with the narrative that it's okay to be this kind of caliber as long as it's not of the social standard the portrayal leads to. Because on the narrative of being evil, as long as it's not absolute, as Marcos flies upon the likelihood. Because what's the likelihood? We see that how people react to portrayal is on is hinged on the narrative of exposure that leads to tolerance and acceptance. Because how do we react to a standard, right? Because portrayal convinces people to react on certain levels. For example, ladies and gentlemen. But then why is this important? Because this is reality to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. Because how does this better characterize the debate? We see that we opt into how different stakeholders react on the narrative that we're trying to proliferate and portray. Yes.
Portraying Marcos as absolutely evil is different from exclusivizing him as the only evil in the picture.
You need to understand that when we portray a certain level of what's absolute, it means that it outweighs different kinds of evil. Because when we say that something is absolute, it's something permanent, it's something unchangeable, it's something more people are going to believe because it's more established upon the hinge of portrayal. But then we say that it's actually really related to that kind of narrative. Because then people are only going to see this as a standard, right? People are not going to think about other things because it's necessarily the portrayal of what's absolute, of what's permanent, of what's the greatest level of evil at the end of the day. But then even if they tell you that it's true that Marcos is the absolute evil, or that the portrayal of Marcos as the absolute arbiter of evil is true, we can see, but then we think that the only good it does is provide a change of mindsets. That people don't need to be like Marcos, or like this discourage people from being like Marcos, for example. We say that even if they tell you that we do not challenge the system, number one, this is wrong because we don't consider Marcos as good when we don't portray him as the absolute evil. We still portray him as evil. It's not just the highest level of standard and social portrayal that we're opting into. We say that it's still regrettable when we have these types of portrayal that sets social standards, that makes people complacent, that makes people believe in false standards, and makes people discredit other kinds of evil that presents harm within the society as a whole. We say that their goal is to currently and in the short term resolve a problem. But then disregards the long-term effects. Because we see that when people become complacent to the idea that it's okay to be this kind of evil as long as it's not as absolute as Marcos, it now hampers us from the long-term effect of trying to eradicate and condemn all kinds of evil. That being corrupt is as evil as putting up martial law to abuse Philippines to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. Because at the end of the day, when we're going to put the context on what's going to be more good and beneficial, we need to think of marginal benefits. What benefits us today and what will benefit us tomorrow, and that only came from OG. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, BPL. Now to provide extensions coming from the opening opposition, let me call on the DLO. Kiryu.
So, ate wag mo talaga is
In a world wherein we still see posts or political posts in our newsfeed about how maybe Marcos uplifted the economy and justifying that Marcos may have been a good leader as opposed to being evil in the first place is the point in which opposition wants to keep on pushing the narrative that Marcos is absolutely evil. But before I move on to my before I move on how creating assets, on how people are completing, on how. Before I move on to the benefit, what good that we got on portraying the Marcos as absolutely evil in the past and in the present, Mr. Chair, let me first take on to what OG has brought on to this debate. Now, OG seems to misunderstand or misinterpret what creating a standard of evil is and creating a standard of what is evil is. and creating the top four or the levels of evil. Because even we're willing to bite the bullet that when you set Marcos as absolutely evil, we set it to the highest form because inherently there are really levels of evils. For example, in criminals in court, some crimes are punished greater than others. We are willing to bite the bullet that there are levels of evils. But what is unchangeable at the very end of the day, Mr. Chair, is that at the end of the day, these actions are still inherently evil, and that these should not be tolerated in the first place, which makes this misunderstanding of the OG's case irrelevant to this debate, in which they were more burdened to prove to us as to how this has done more harm than good at the very end of the day. MG was relevant to this debate because he talks about how this has done more good because it set as a standard to unify people, to actually mobilize against the Marcos regime at the very end of the day. Because of course, our opposition, we're here to prove to you as to how this has done more good than harm at the very end of the day. We talk to you about how this argument is relevant because we all concede to the case that the Marcos regime needed to be stopped, and that the regime needed to be overthrown in the first place. Only when we treated Marcos as absolutely evil did we actually try to unify those people who were divided, when we tried to stop these Marcos apologists from saying that he implemented feeding programs, but he gave scholarships to individuals like us of the PSI system. But still, at the very end of the day, we unify those people because we still say he is still absolutely evil at the very end of the day. At first, let me emphasize onto how creating what are the benefits or what are the good that comes out when we treat the Marcos as absolutely evil, and as to how this relates to the present Mr. Chair. Second is that we will engage with what OG tried to bring into the debate on how political discourse is more likely to happen on their side. But let me tell you, but I will explain it later on as to why this is actually more relevant in our case. But first and foremost, what happens when you treat the Marcos as absolutely evil? We need to understand in the present, Mr. Chair, that there are Marcos apologists that still exist today because one, the Marcos family still has control within the government because Marcos family has still gained influence, has still gained power over certain Marcos apologists that allow these individuals to stay in power. Now, because of the inherent power that the Marcos family already has, they use individuals who are subject to fall for the narratives that we do not want to highlight, that Emily talked about earlier, in which we concede to the fact that there are multiple narratives, but we want to highlight how Marcos is absolutely evil. Marcos uses these individuals who actually want to highlight or want to use these other narratives to justify Marcos' actions in the first place. But before that, your point.
When you unified anti-Marcoses, it was also the same time that Marcos Apologies in Ilocos was formed. Perhaps the reason why we are faced with apologies is because we polarize society so much with respect to Marcos.
Okay, but that perfectly leads to my point on how political discourse is still more likely on our side. Because when we talk about when we treat Marcos as absolutely evil, we're willing to bite the bullet that there are certain individuals who choose to research and on certain narratives such as, oh, he actually implemented these feeding programs, oh, he actually boosted the economy at the very end of the day. Well, actually, that only fueled discourse amongst people who were actually against Marcos. People who were mistreated by Marcos, people who were against Marcos actually came out to correct these certain individuals at the very end of the day. That is why political discourse at the very end of the day is still more more likely to occur on our side, and it's still possible to happen in our side of the debate, Mr. Chair. Okay, so what I want to talk to you, what opening opposition simply wants to tell you is that that treating Marcos is a necessary good, and it is necessary, and it proves to be more better. It proves to be better at the very end of the day, and as to why we resort to this at the very end of the day. Sit 6 minutes. It's still better at the very end of the day that we treat Marcos as absolutely evil, because we tell you that that it was needed to mobilize these certain individuals to go up against Marcos, this allows the Marcos family from continuing on to use individuals who fall into these multiple narratives, or who use these other narratives to justify these certain actions, and that it fuels political discourse more likely on our side. And with that, I propose Abby Charta Maduka.
Okay, so thank you, DLO. Now, to open the closing half, we go on the member of the government. Hear.
Ito na kayo. No to kidding you. Wala gusto pang niko.
Yes to daddies. No to kidding you.
Oh my God, ganun ka lang.
So, mga 10 years old.
My God.
Kaya ko buhayin. Sustain ko.
May I ask, is the chair? You, sir. Okay. When you try to take a look at the Philippine history books, Mr. Chair, the iconic label of Marcos, for example, is easily evil, a dictator, a plunderer, and all of these derogatory things. The highlight of his regime must be painted in a very dark picture. This becomes reprehensible in the ways that people are learning about the issue. It easily becomes observable as to how the biases, the extreme biases, even, Mr. Speaker, are being triumphed in most cases. Another problem in portraying something as completely, absolutely evil is that it obstructs the essence of evilness, and it presents every little bit of goodness or the benefit in such issue, Mr. Speaker. It focuses on a single aspect and we tell you that it's very reprehensible in the very first place. What did we get from opening exchange? Opening exchange was very limited into fleshing out mechanizations of their arguments, Mr. Speaker. From OG, they fell short in trying to clarify their premise to support their arguments, and OO built their arguments in assumpted premises, Mr. Speaker. OO is still stuck in the past by trying to fight for the motion in the older context, and I will move on to that right now. First thing that we got coming from LO is that it becomes the driving force of the people power revolution, right? On the first level, we tell you that you could achieve, and this people power revolution has been achieved not because of the complete portrayal of Marcos as somebody that's evil, but because it has shown that Marcos has done more evil things than good in the very first place. They have considered both sides rather than just trying to get or to become ignorant on how he is very evil and then go into that revolution in the very first place. But even if we try to accept that kind of context coming from LO, we tell you that looking at it in a modern context, Mr. Speaker, we believe this is obsolete. We believe that it hurts the society in the current time if we continue this kind of portrayal in the very first place. We tell you that it breeds Marcos apologists, for example, who are ignorant of the other spectrum with no sense of a healthy discourse on the other end. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, how DLO has told you that it spearheads a healthy discussion because nobody really sides with the Marcos family, for example. We tell you that that is not a kind of discussion that we would want, Mr. Speaker, because we tell you that it is not even a discussion in the very first place. It's just an outright bullying of one side without trying to take a look at the other spectrum or even trying to take a look at the other perspectives when you would want to have a discourse without learning even of the other side of the coin, for example. On our side, coming from CG, you get to take a look at the bigger picture, Mr. Speaker. How are you going to contextualize and frame this debate? This is our delineation coming from OG. Because what did we get from OG, Mr. Speaker? They told you that this kind of evil portrayal, for example, is giving us a standard or even the capacity to standardize and then tolerate lesser evils in the very first place. We tell you that that is a logical jump, Mr. Speaker, and we tell you that there's a different kind of premise as to how this is being achieved in the very first place. When a discourse happens, Mr. Speaker, about the issue of Marcos, of course, when somebody portrays him as an absolutely evil dictator, for example, the other side rises that tries to champion him
as somebody who is completely good. What do we mean by this, Mr. Speaker? It stretches out the spectrum of ideologies, for example, and it polarizes both sides in the type of discussions that you would have. These discussions that you would have will not be healthy in the longer run because it would only try to take a look at the extremes and not regard the other side of the coin, for example, or the other side of the issue. That's the kind of discourse that you will be getting if you would want to side with OO. There is the breeding of pro versus anti-Marcos, for example, into which they are all in the majority of the extremes, Mr. Speaker. Now, with this kind of premise, we tell you that number one pragmatic effect or social implication is this, is that it becomes a justification of Marcos as somebody who is good, or that his leadership is something that is good, Mr. Speaker. Why is this bad in the very first place? We tell you that it becomes a toleration, for example, of Duterte's political ways of being a leader in which the minorities are completely or continuously being displaced, Mr. Speaker. Because when you try to take a look at how you would want to portray Marcos in these cases, these people would also have these sides into which they see Marcos as somebody who is completely good. And with all of those leaderships and even the political ways that he tries to handle the people, they try to justify the current administration, or even in the longer run, Mr. Speaker, they try to justify the political systems of these administrations to something as good, even without trying to take a look at the other side. Because that is the really reprehensible thing that we get from OO, right? You can teach people on two sides as to how Marcos did something good or how he was evil, Mr. Speaker, and reprehensible. However, in the end, we still concede that no matter how much good Marcos did, his bad deeds still outweigh the good. In OO, you lose this kind of education or discourse or even an analysis of comparison, Mr. Speaker, through trying to look at the both sides. Second pragmatic influence or implication of this, Mr. Speaker, is to how we actually educate our people or students in the very first place. We tell you that if you would want to portray Marcos as somebody who is completely evil without having any good sides of him at all, people become ignorant in the two sides of coin, into the two sides of the issue, for example. This happens all throughout the history books, for example, to these students, to these children, and even to these people who are already grown, Mr. Speaker. This is very reprehensible because it tries to take a look at the polar extremes without trying to consider the other sides. For example, the infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, into which how Marcos, for example, has tried to raise up the buildings in the Philippines, right? But then these kinds of apologists do not know that because of this, that the Philippines was being drowned in debt, for example. Trying to take a look at both sides of the coins or the issue, Mr. Speaker, is what's important in our cases. But before that, yes.
Kennard, I think extremism doesn't literally result to one-sided discourse, but it results towards polarization, where it explicitly presents the two ideologies.
We believe, okay, Mr. Speaker, we reject that premise. We tell you when we say you portray something that is already absolutely evil, or even if you compare this polarization and extremism in the very first place, the ideologies, even if they are not being acted out, the way you deliver this information, Mr. Speaker, the way you deliver and present these kinds of ideologies in the very first place, is already trying to disregard the other side of the spectrum, for example. That's what happens when you try to portray Marcos or how you portray these kinds of discourses even as something that is already absolutely evil. What did you get on our side, Mr. Speaker? In our side, exclusively from CG, we told you the right premise or the right reason as to how these people did the People Power Revolution, for example. And we also told you the right reason as to why these people would justify bad actions of the current administration, for example, because of the justification and the polarization rather than the setting of standards of what is evil that is coming from OG, Mr. Speaker. And lastly, we have also told you how the education system, for example, or how we educate the people of the Philippines is being actually sided and biased on one side in the very first place. And we tell you that hurts the essence of education even, or how we try to portray the history of its accurateness in the very first place. We are very proud to propose. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you, member of the government. Now, to further this debate, we call on the member of the opposition. Here.
Mic test. Ladies and gentlemen, when you demonize a dictator, you do this for a reason. because you see that there is a need for change and a need to end this hell that was the Marcos regime Philippines, and evolve our thinking to unite the Philippines as there was a catalyst that was Marcos, this absolute evil, the Filipino Satan incarnate. Now, firstly, rebuttals for the openings. Now, given their point about the inductive learning, where they will let the people learn for themselves, we tell you that without a catalyst, there would still be no change in our society. Now, let me reframe this for you. We tell you that the good that painting Marcos as evil was the catalyst for the Filipino change, ladies and gentlemen. And their point about the social standard, which they have still failed to prove how this happened and why is this relevant, we tell you that I will go hardline where our case is a big even if. Now, coming from Kennard's case, we tell you that extremism doesn't result to a one side of discourse, but rather encourages discourse as a whole. Because without the two extremes, we would still not find the middle ground that is discourse. We would still not be here talking about how Marcos was the absolute evil, the Satan of the Philippines. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there was a mal characterization of what is good in this context. We tell you that we still want to frame Marcos as Satan, meaning hardline, no middle ground, extreme. Now, let me reframe with the confusion of what we consider as good in this context. We consider good as the preservation and eruption of the essence of democracy, proceeding from painting Marcos as the absolute evil, ladies and gentlemen. Our stand is clear and simple in this debate. We identify good as the political establishment and social awareness, political establishment of the past and social awareness of the present tense in this debate, following the catalyst that was painting Marcos as the evil dictator, as Satan. Now, how did establishing Marcos as an absolute evil dictator lead to firstly political awareness and establishment in the past and social awareness in the present tense? Two facets of argumentation. Firstly, past. Painting Marcos was the eye-opener for the Filipino people that led to the unity because we needed to fight this evil and led to the eruption of the legendary EDSA revolution that led to the cultivation of the vocal Filipino spirit that we still have on to this day. And without this catalyst that was the Marcos regime, the evil Satan Marcos regime, who would not be here with the Filipino spirit to talk about anything right now. And looking at our present tense, looking at our status quo, where we see the opposition of the people to Duterte parallel on how the people react and how vocal they were regarding the matters of the past tense, we tell you that it is the healthy discourse of the extremes that leads us to what we have to this day. Meaning that their whole case regarding the essence of education is unfaceted, ladies and gentlemen, where we box out every house in this debate. We tell you that the only essence that we need to know is the effect of Marcos to our society and at the hearts of the people. Meaning that we want to identify Marcos as a big even if we paint Marcos as Satan, regardless of how he was actually as a dictator, we still credit him for giving us the catalyst to preserve and to erupt our Filipino spirit in the value of democracy at the end of the day. Present tense. Now, these current problems, because with extremism, there is discourse with the spectrum of both sides, and because we cannot eliminate extremism in the first place, what we can do, what the best thing that we can do is live with this extremism and focus on political, social, and relevant discourse on both sides, meaning forcing a middle ground. Meaning that what they have as elimination of discourse is not totally exclusive on their side. We have it as well, but only better, ladies and gentlemen. And to tie it all back, regardless of what Marcos actually was as a dictator, we still needed and we still need to paint the picture that he was the Filipino Satan, so the Filipino people could be their own Saint Michael, the Archangel, and unite as a nation to eliminate that evil. Ladies and gentlemen, this is justified because of the effect it has to the people, and we still take Marcos before that. Sure.
If extremism caters discourse, give us a discussion how this discourse is better in your side than in a non-polarized society.
Sure, but because this is not what we want to tackle at the end of the day. We still think that it is present and better because because of the fact that we need to acknowledge that there are two extremes, ladies and gentlemen, rather than just a normative polarized society wherein the voice is just single-faceted and no extreme opinions, no comparison of opinions at all, ladies and gentlemen. Sure opening.
Do you agree that people tolerate the martial law of Duterte is an example of a toxic discourse of that portrayal?
Now, this is the exact reason why we still want to value the painting of Marcos as evil. Because if we did not want to paint Marcos as evil, this discourse would not happen as absolute evil. Because without that painting, this martial law would be totally accepted with our polarized society, ladies and gentlemen. We still tell you that to conclude this debate, this is justified because of the effect of it to the people, and we still take Marcos Satan for giving us the bad so we could identify and cultivate what is good. Now, let me send my thank you letter to Marcos in hell, ladies and gentlemen. With love, Paulo Jose Luis Traspe. Proud to oppose.
Okay, so thank you, member of the opposition. And the final crystallize the case of the government bench that we call the government whip. Thank you.
Lagyan ko ulit.
Same in debates. When we don't give a little concession as to the reverse case that we hold, the debate becomes messy and far off that it does so much harm with the whole debate that we no longer know how to clinch that round. It is notice that this is parallel to our society's debate about Marcos. Every time we are afraid to give minor concessions or acknowledgments to some achievements that we are stretching and polarizing Marcos as absolutely good or bad. But secondly, we blind students to the achievements of Marcos, which they now feel the burden to put into social knowledge, even when to put into social knowledge some achievements that even in reality are not really achievements of Marcos, because they are curious as to how a certain person becomes absolutely evil with no any sides of good, especially that he is a successful politician at that time. So overall, from closing government, we think that these two cases are the reason why right now we justify the kind of politics that Marcos introduced to the Philippines, Mr. Speaker. But before anything else, a couple of responses to closing opposition. Because they told you that extremism delivers discourse in a polarized manner, Mr. Speaker. Since Kennard already argued that this is unlikely, let's take a look at if CES is right, what is going to happen. We tell you that when extremism delivers this discourse, or even when this extremism delivers discourse, the quality of discourse is bad because it resorts to a mere advertisement or propaganda of harms and benefits of a Marcos regime. Conversely, on our side, when we present and acknowledge good and evil, or some good and evil, we become more comparative to the good and evil that we now think, even when given these goods that Marcos gave the Philippines, why is it still justified that he was overthrown in his regime? We realize that even when there is so much good, for instance, when evil is present, then we need to address that evil, Mr. Speaker. Because under their side, we think that this kind of narrative coming from opposition is the reason why we don't know how to take a look at Duterte's administration, because we don't know how to be comparative as to the kind of goods or evil that Duterte does to the country, Mr. Speaker. But second argument coming from closing opposition is this: extremism forces a central ground, Mr. Speaker. We tell you that this is a failure of characterization as to what extremism is, because when you tackle about extremism, it's about two sides of polarized spectrum that doesn't know how to find a middle ground because they're so busy with trying to present harms, absolute harms, and absolute benefits, for example, that they don't know how to be comparative at that. Extremism don't know how to acknowledge, may know how to acknowledge, but it doesn't call to the social action that closing opposition values in this debate. Says needs to prove to us later in her speech as to why this kind of discourse coming or this kind of extremism coming from their side forces a central ground, because we think that even today, in terms of the pro-Marcos and anti-Marcos, we don't see a middle ground as to how they really see Marcos and as to how we are going to deal with this Marcos regime, Mr. Speaker. Even PJ told us that without polarization, martial law is justified, without giving us much analysis as to how this letter A case becomes the letter B case of PJ, Mr. Speaker. Says needs to clarify that argument. But secondly, what did we get coming from opening exchange? Because we need to analyze as to whether or not the opening exchange really is the best clash in this debate, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, about the opening government, Mr. Speaker, about their case on comparing Marcos and Duterte so that Duterte appears as a lesser evil. Coming from Kennard, not only do we contrast Marcos to Duterte in this kind, although it might be a valid argument coming from opening government, but coming from CG, the kind of politics that Marcos introduced to the Philippines is the reason why we justify Duterte's reign in the first place. The kind of politics that Marcos brought is the reason why we have Duterte in the presidency at that, Mr. Speaker. Because the Marcos politics of fear and anxiety justified Duterte's use of fear to initiate the drug war even at the expense of innocent lives, because the people's anxiety have been touched. Meaning that when we portray Marcos as an absolute evil, what we're actually doing, Mr. Speaker, is to make a polarization of spectrum, for example, that now we have more people on the right side of the spectrum portraying the martial law or the kind of politics of Marcos as good, Mr. Speaker, because they can't accept the fact that a certain person is absolutely evil at that, Mr. Speaker. Secondly, they talked about when we have martial law as absolutely evil, then we lose sense of what evil really is. We get apathy towards the lesser evil of modern day politicians. Firstly, even if this could be a valid argument, they need to justify as to why this happens immediately. When Old W commented in a POI that absolutizing Marcos' evil doesn't exclusivize evil to him, there wasn't any discussion coming from DPM as to how they answer this case. How then would CG answer this kind of POI of CES? Even if this POI is valid, we need to hear a discussion as to why, in the reverse, in their case, we don't have the harm that they presented to us, Mr. Speaker. As to why, in their case, for example, of absolutizing evil, for example, we don't get to see how some politicians are evil, perhaps, Mr. Speaker. We need to hear a comparative coming from their side, Mr. Speaker. But let's go with the opening opposition, Mr. Speaker, about how they tell us that this kind of argument or this kind of portraying of absolute evil plays a role in overthrowing of Marcoses. Firstly, we think that this is already going back into decades, for example, but the reason why Marcos was overthrown is not the portrayal of absolute evilness, rather Cardinal Sin's rhetoric that despite the goods that Marcos gave the Philippines, the evil of Marcos is greater than his good, so that his good no longer justifies his evil. But even if they are right, we think that right now it is no longer good to portray Marcos as absolutely evil, because it only polarizes the spectrum of beliefs such that we are now left with Marcos apologies. Notice that the reason why we have Marcos apologies coming from CG is because they are uneducated and dissatisfied as to how society perceives Marcos as absolutely evil. Coming from CG, we need to educate these people as to how, for example, Mr. Speaker, is Marcos, that even if there are some good, there is more evil, such that we create a discourse as to why it is still justified that despite the goods of Marcos, it is still justified that we overthrow this away from his regime or power in the presidency. But lastly, about the political discourse, they said the discourse on Marcos' evil only happens when we portray Marcos' absolute evilness. We think that it's not exclusive on their side. They need to prove why we don't portray him as absolutely evil, then people no longer attempt to research about him. In fact, it is only when we acknowledge some good do we have an incentive to ask why, objectively, even when you acknowledge some good, is it justified to portray Marcos as evil, as unjust? If you want discourse, you need to acknowledge first some good. You need to concede to the little amount of goodness of Marcos. However, we need to justify why the evil outweighs the good government side is proud to present. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you, Government Whip. Now, to finally summarize the entire debate, let's call on the opposition whip. Here.
Test. Mr. Speaker, in a certain debate, in order for you to win, you have to explicitly tell us your extreme idea that you are actually urging the people to believe. The goal of this debate is where is the preservation of democracy best addressed, Mr. Speaker, wherein we in CO explicitly demonize individual hegemony that hampers a healthy opposition, limits the voices of the people on the ground, that eventually disregards the needs of the people, which should be the role of the government. The stand is two things. Number one, cultivating the culture of social awareness itself, and secondly, grounding a good political establishments. But before anything else, engagements. Coming from OG, they tell people that corruption is bad, Mr. Speaker, but in an inductive way, wherein it's not being extreme or it's not being explicitly telling people that corruption itself is extreme. Coming from CO, what we want is a deductive way of imposition or a deductive way of telling people or explicitly feeding people that this is bad or this is good. Meaning, if you explicitly present the two ideologies, all the more that people will see the middle ground. Just like how adjudicators, for example, see the middle ground in a certain debate, if government side present this ideology and opposition side present this ideology. Because you as a person has an ultimate extreme ideology that you present or you uphold. Meaning, you can't be a neutral person all the time, Mr. Speaker. Particularly, if I'm a debater, I cannot say that, okay, Marcos is quite bad, Marcos is quite good. Because I have to explicitly tell you my side in order for you to understand which is good, which is bad. But secondly, they told you that we should not put a standard on evil itself because it will portray Marcos as the exclusive evil, which we think is very much not credited in this debate. But this is how we delineate. Number one, the extent of the argument coming from our opening is making Marcos be accountable by portraying him as evil so that people will shame him. We told you coming from PJ that two extensions that we made. Number one, the social spectrum. Number two, the political spectrum. And we grounded this by the principle of consequences itself, wherein we don't literally tell people that this extreme means is bad because it's extreme. It doesn't mean that it's extreme, then the consequences are not good. And we think that if the consequences are good, then fine, it's beneficial. But thirdly, let's proceed to CG. Number one, Mr. Speaker, I think that is very hypocrite coming from the two of them telling us that there should be a discourse if people are neutral or if people concede to one another. Because it makes them a neutral debater or it makes them a neutral discourse itself. In order for you to have a discourse, you need to explicitly go with a certain side or need to go into an extreme ideology in order for you to present that. That's the reason why literary works are always subjectively biased. Because they're telling people that this is my side. And he's telling people that this is my side. Meaning, if we're having a discourse through extreme ideologies, then all the more that people will understand. All the more that people will have the middle ground to understand these kinds of things. Because extremism don't necessarily lead into one-sided discourse. It leads to polarization. Meaning, if I'm an extreme conservative and Raven is an extreme liberal, then we have a discourse, Mr. Speaker, through polarization itself. And polarization is not necessarily bad because we consider that there are two ideologies given. But next thing, contentions in this debate. Why is it justifiable that the portrayal is extremely evil? We're not telling you that Marcos may be nice or Marcos may be mean, these kinds of things. But what does good mean? Because coming from all the benches, they didn't really tackle what is good or what is the grounding for we can say that something is good or bad later, Ray. But coming from PJ, he told you a while ago that the means don't necessarily coincide or the means are not necessary. Because as long as the consequences are beneficial, then we go with that. And what does this mean, Mr. Speaker? It is through deductive learning itself, wherein we explicitly tell people that this is the way littering, but this is the way to tell, we are explicitly telling them that this is good and this is bad. Let's proceed to a cost-benefit analysis, right? Coming from opposition, there is a social awareness. Try to look at the lens of the past later. Try to look at the lens of the past wherein it incentivizes national unity itself because we're extremely telling people that this is bad. Meaning we're incentivizing them to be active citizens itself. But in the present, we're actually telling people and we're cultivating the culture of a good opposition. Because try to look at how people were aware that Marcos martial law was actually bad. Then when Duterte, for example, explained or discoursed on a martial law, then all the more that people were skeptical. And being skeptical is not necessarily bad because they were aware of the realities of the past martial laws, meaning they're skeptical on these kinds of things before that. Yes.
There is a mischaracterization. We aren't saying that we become neutral. What we're saying is that sometimes we need to acknowledge some good such that we don't force people to justify Marcos as absolutely good. This doesn't mean going neutral.
I think that is necessarily not engaging towards the side or towards the neutrality itself. Because when you say that you're extreme, coming from PJ, then we extremely go with this side. Meaning, if you concede towards these things, then you're not extreme on that side. Meaning you're neutrally there, or meaning you're neutrally acknowledging these kinds of things, where in fact we don't want neutrality. But later, we're telling you that we're cultivating a good culture of opposition. But let's try to engage, Mr. Speaker, in a very concise comparative analysis. Coming from government side, what they want is slightly conceding and slightly not conceding. But we tell you that the analysis of this is this. Discourse in that side is very much unclear, as people are always on the middle ground. Because that's the problem of Raven. He wants people to not be extremely biased, but he wants people to be always in the middle ground, which is very unclear. We tell you that if you want to go into middle ground, you have to be presented with the extreme biases itself, or towards... Oh my God. But if people are always on the middle ground, then all the more that they cannot decide which is bad and which is good. But coming from the opposition side, what we want is extreme method itself. Meaning, if there is an extreme method of presenting these kinds of ideologies or presenting these kinds of ideas, then there is polarization. It leads to polarization of two different ideologies. This is the reason why, again, literary works are always biased in conveying their emotions or conveying their propositions. Because in the present, we incentivize a rise of a new idea in the spectrum. People see the middle ground if there is an extreme discourse rather than playing safe than just staying in the middle ground itself. If you want a healthy discourse, then be extreme, not conceding.
So thank you everyone. We may touch the house.
Josh, patawag daw ako.
Yan kasi, mabilis.
Patawag daw ako.
Ayun na.
So while maybe we're waiting for the other judges to arrive, I just wanted to award some certificates of participation to the participating schools. So once your institution is called, please send one representative as soon as possible. Thank you. Let's have AdZU Senior High School.
Mag-picture pa po, hindi na.
Picture. Again na.
Hi, Chef. Senior high school? Thank you. Thank you.
Let's have next AdZU Junior High School.
Love you.
Thank you. Let's have the next institution we have from Caraga State University. Do we have Caraga State University? Okay. Next, let's have Caraga State University Senior High School. CSU Senior High School.
Hanapin ako sa picture. Ito na ka? Next.
Alright, thank you. Okay, before we proceed, last, we have Caraga Regional Science High School. One representative, please.
Sorry. At least kamay tayo. Sige, 1, 2, 3.
Alright, so I guess I already saw Nina and Trisha, so we can proceed with the Grandfinals. Lee, I don't know. Calling Lee if you're around.
And have you guys seen my charger? Atin ba to?